Okay, let's get started since I need to get everything out, because my life took a drastic turnaround a year ago. I didn't anticipate telling my tale in this way, but sometimes you're left asking, how did things even get to this point, when the people you believed had your back turned on you? Let's go back a little. Claire is the younger sister of my best friend Nate. As a typical bunch of kids, we all grew up in the same area and spent time together. We went together occasionally, of course, but usually as friends of friends, so nothing unusual happened between us. I don't mean to come across as impolite, but Claire was always different. Although no one discussed it publicly, everyone was aware that she had some mental health problems. Nate hardly ever mentioned it, and I understood that it wasn't my place to inquire. Suddenly, around a year ago, Claire messaged me to let me know she was expecting. All right, awesome. People become pregnant. The worst part is that she claims that I am the father. I simply froze in that instant. I lost all mental clarity. Claire was saying that we somehow ended up having a child together, despite the fact that Claire and I had never been close or even intimate. I told her bluntly, "Claire, this makes no sense," because I was in such disbelief. We've never even been close, let alone intimate. However, she persisted in claiming that I was the father, as if I were expected to magically recall a night that never occurred. I made an effort to remain composed, figuring that perhaps this was simply a reflection of whatever mental turmoil she was experiencing. But I was internally freaking out over the whole affair. She flatly refused to take a prenatal paternity test when I begged her to. I was now unable to comprehend this. Why not take the test and make things plain if she was so certain it was my child? Instead, though, she began to blame me, saying things like, "You're leaving us before the baby is even here." She persisted in promoting that story, and to be honest, it was beginning to irritate me. I believed that would be the end of it. I was quite clear that I wasn't signing anything or accepting any responsibility for a child that wasn't mine, unless there was a test showing paternity. My parents learned about the entire situation a few weeks later, but I had no idea that it was just the start of a huge family breakdown. Let me tell you something about my parents. They are all about family values. As a result, they thought the worst of me as soon as they learned of Claire's pregnancy. They didn't try to listen to me or ask questions. Rather, they vented all of their resentment and disappointment on me. They said I was a shame, a deadbeat, and irresponsible. I tried to explain that I hadn't been with Claire and that she was making things up, but they didn't listen. They didn't give me an opportunity to refute Claire's claim or offer an explanation. They believed that I was attempting to avoid my obligations. They saw me as already guilty. After that, we got into some very intense disputes. Rude remarks were exchanged, and to be honest, I felt offended and bitter. The most absurd thing is that I wasn't even in the same state when Claire allegedly became pregnant. My own parents, who were supposed to believe me more than anybody else, couldn't stop thinking that I was somehow to blame for this baby. We couldn't possibly see one other, much less do anything more because she was spending a whole month with a friend in a different city. My parents dismissed this when I brought it up to them, stating that people make mistakes. However, this was not a casual error. Rather, it was a serious charge that could destroy my life. My remarks seemed meaningless. By this time, Claire was roughly 6 months pregnant, and the entire family had turned against me. Every phone contact, text message, and family meal served as a reminder that they believed I needed to man up and take responsibility for a child that wasn't mine. I was at my breaking point. No matter what I said, no one would believe me. It was as if I were trapped in a bad dream. Although most of my friends supported me, a few of them even began to ask, "Are you sure, man? Perhaps you simply can't recall something?" And that only made the feelings of loneliness and frustration worse. Then the final thunderbolt came. My parents made the decision to cut me off if I didn't take charge and do the right thing for this baby. They were dead serious, despite my initial belief that they were bluffing. They sat me down, met my eyes, and threatened to disown me if I didn't own up to being the father. I would be expelled from the family. And finally, as I continued to refuse, they did. The pain I felt is beyond words. I was being thrown out because of an unfounded accusation by the two people who reared me and whom I believed would support me no matter what. It was cruel. After that, things somehow became worse. I had a mixture of perplexity, fury, and genuine grief. My mom played the proud grandma in the hospital with Claire when the baby was delivered, and it wasn't until much later that I realized any of this was taking place. I had to take matters into my own hands and ask the court to compel Claire to undergo a paternity test because she was still refusing. The relief I had was unbelievable, and the results proved what I had been saying all along. There was simply no chance that I was the father. However, it was accompanied by a powerful surge of rage. I emailed my parents the test results, hoping they would finally comprehend and perhaps even offer an apology for their treatment of me. Instead, they began sending false apologies over the phone and via text. They pleaded for my forgiveness and offered me gifts and cash. As if to make up for their betrayal, my dad even sent me several $100s in the mail. Of course, I kept the money. In light of everything they had done to me, it seemed like the least they could do. But pardoning them? That was another matter. I made it plain that I wasn't going to put my heart in their hands again if they had been so ready to reject me because of a lie. This whole nightmare started there. My therapist and a few of my friends still advise giving them another chance. If someone would rather believe a lie about you than give you the benefit of the doubt, how can you forgive them? The only thing that comes to mind whenever I think about it is how quickly they abandoned me. When I most needed them, they let me down. You would think that the mayhem would have subsided once I was shown to be not the father, that everyone, including my parents, would realize at last that they had made a grave error. However, things went in a completely other direction. The day after I delivered my parents the paternity test results, I anticipated at least some sort of apology acknowledging what they had done to me, as if establishing my innocence wasn't enough to make them accept they were wrong. Rather, a barrage of calls, texts, and voicemails flooded my phone. There was no reference to the charges they leveled at me in the lengthy, wordy messages my mother was leaving, which talked about how much she wanted her family back together and how it was time to move forward. They didn't really acknowledge how easily they let me go. They pretended that a few family meals and smiles would make everything better, as though that would take away the sense of betrayal I had experienced. It seemed insulting, not only contemptuous. My father, however, went one step farther. I couldn't even make sense of the text he sent me, proposing to purchase me a new car if I would come back home and let bygones be bygones. Did they genuinely believe they could simply purchase my pardon? As I read more of their communications, I came to the conclusion that they had no understanding at all and that they only wanted things to return to normal for their own comfort, not because they genuinely cared about the suffering they had caused me. After that, things only got worse. After seeing the results of the paternity test, Claire became quite upset. She doubled on, telling everyone in town that I must have faked the test in some way, rather than owning up to her mistake. She claimed that I had somehow persuaded a lab to skew DNA results to my advantage. Who even thinks that way, really? She was adamant on portraying me as the bad guy, even though I'm just a regular guy with no resources or authority to do anything like that. Additionally, it didn't take long for passers-by to start treating me like I was some deadbeat who had abandoned his child in our little town, where gossip spread like wildfire. It seemed like every time I went to the grocery store, someone would be whispering to themselves or giving me a filthy look. It infuriated me that some individuals even came up to me and asked why I wasn't standing up for my kid. Even though my paternity test results showed that I wasn't the father, nobody seemed to be interested in the information anymore. People believed Claire's narrative because she was out there acting like the victim. The worst thing? A couple of my friends even began to view me differently, questioning whether I was concealing something. Naturally, my parents then began phoning once more. My mom didn't seem to comprehend the harm they'd caused, or perhaps she didn't want to, and she continued leaving me these guilt-tripping voicemails, telling me how much she missed her baby boy and how she just wanted to have her family back together. She persisted in attempting to ignore everything in the hopes that it would somehow go away if she simply disregarded the previous year. My dad tried to bribe me again by offering to pay off my car loan if I would just come back to the family. I wanted to believe she was sincere, But it was difficult to get past the fact that they chose to believe Claire when I needed them to believe in me. That struck me more strongly than anything else, and I'm not sure why. It was so outdated and contemptuous of what they had done. I became aware of how little they knew about the situation. Claire didn't stop there either, because they were still more concerned with improving their own feelings than with putting things right. She began contacting individuals I knew, including my ex-girlfriend Sarah. After years of not communicating, she abruptly texted me saying, "We need to talk." I wasn't sure what she wanted, but when we finally met, she revealed that Claire had been attempting to rekindle old drama and persuade Sarah that I was a bad person who had abandoned his own kid, even going so far as to imply that I had done the same to Sarah. What I was hearing was unbelievable. Claire seemed intent on destroying my reputation, my family, and my friendships. I made the decision right away that I could not allow this to continue. I gave Claire a call and urged her to stop, that I was tired of her lies and games, and that she should refrain from mentioning me. She simply hung up after laughing. Talking to a wall was like that. Nothing I said could reach her since she was so engrossed in her delusions. I recognized then that I needed legal assistance. Even though I didn't want to go there, I had no other option. My parents were supporting Claire while she was out there damaging my image, and I was barely surviving. I contacted a lawyer who gave me advice on how to protect myself, such as obtaining a restraining order against Claire and letting my parents know that meddling would not be accepted. The entire ordeal was draining and unreal. Anxiety persisted over court dates, paperwork, and consultations. However, I also experienced a sense of control that I hadn't had in a while. I felt as though a burden had been removed off my shoulders when the restraining order was eventually granted, because I was at last taking action to defend myself and recover my life from the insanity they had dragged me into. Officially, Claire was prohibited from getting in touch with me or telling any more falsehoods. In contrast, my parents were incensed. In a lengthy, remorseful email, my mother told me she never thought her son would tear the family apart by obtaining a restraining order. She used typical manipulation when she stated things like, "Family is supposed to stick together no matter what." I didn't answer. I was unable to. I had run out of things to say to them now. They had to follow the boundaries I had established, but naturally, things didn't end there. My car was vandalized when I returned home a few weeks after the restraining order was issued. The word liar had been keyed into its side by someone. Although I had no evidence that it was Claire, who else could it be? My family and a few close acquaintances were the only ones who were aware of the restraining order. It didn't seem like a coincidence. I reported it to the police, but nothing happened. It served as yet another reminder that sometimes, despite your best efforts to act morally, the people who ought to care about you the most might really cause you the greatest pain. After that, I began parking my car at friends' houses, and, as a precaution, I even put security cameras around my flat. I felt as though I was constantly on edge, anticipating the next assault, rumor, or betrayal. Eventually, though, things began to settle down. Claire and my parents were legally required to leave me alone because of the restraining order. I was able to breathe for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. I didn't have to keep checking back to see when the next shoe would drop. Even with the restraining order and the distance I'd placed between us, there were still repercussions to deal with. But I had my life back, or at least the beginnings of it. I had to repeatedly explain the situation to acquaintances, co-workers, and even some extended family members who had fallen for my parents' distorted version of events since they had told so many lies to so many people. Not everyone trusted me, and it was exhausting. While some individuals were encouraging, others gave me doubtful looks as if they couldn't quite believe my parents would take such drastic measures. However, knowing the reality was sufficient for me. In retrospect, I saw how easily family members can turn against you if you don't match their narrative. It seemed as though they would rather live in a fantasy world in which I was the bad guy than confront the truth about what they had done. But if I've learned anything, it's that you have to make your own decisions sometimes. You cannot allow anyone, including family, to rule your life, no matter how painful or alienating it may be. For the first time in a long time, I felt as though I had a future that was all mine, unaffected by their criticism and manipulation. I was unsure of what would happen next, but I was certain that I would not return. I believed that severing my relationship with Claire and my parents would be the last step. I reasoned that when I cut them out of my life, things would eventually start to settle down and I would be able to move on and get past this. However, it seems that life had other ideas. A few weeks after I deleted Claire from everything and sent that email to my parents, I received a message from Marcus, an old buddy from high school. Since we hadn't spoken in years, I thought he was simply catching up when he suddenly reached out. However, I was taken aback when he asked me whether I was doing okay right away. I initially dismissed it as a polite check-in, but he later explained his true motivation. He had been contacted by my parents. My parents had been going around to people I hardly knew, old friends, distant relatives, and even acquaintances, telling them all that I was going through something and that they were worried about me. They were painting this picture of me as unstable and in need of help, as if I had somehow gone insane for cutting them off. Marcus and I weren't even close back in the day, so I knew immediately that something was wrong when they reached out to him specifically. They had presented themselves as the worried, loving parents merely attempting to connect with their distressed son. The kicker, of course, Marcus was cool with it, but they were telling everyone that I should apologize for interrupting them. He wanted to alert me since he thought something wasn't adding up. My parents, however, didn't stop there. I began receiving messages over the course of the following few days from people I hadn't spoken to in years, including distant family members, folks I'd met a few times, and more. The premise of each one was the same. Your parents are really worried about you, or maybe you should give them another chance. It felt like some kind, twisted public relations effort in which they were attempting to paint me as the bad guy for establishing limits, and I must admit that I was shocked. My parents were out there doing their hardest to paint me as the unstable one when I was simply trying to move on. The last straw came when I felt as though I was living in another reality where the individuals I had previously trusted were trying all in their power to turn everyone I knew against me. They got in touch with my employer, who called me into his office one day while wearing an oddly serious expression. He inquired about the state of affairs at home. Until he mentioned that my parents had called the office, I didn't understand what he was talking about. I couldn't believe it when they called him directly after somehow obtaining his contact information and saying that I wasn't in a good mood and that they were concerned about my well-being. By contacting my manager to portray me as unstable, my parents were now actively attempting to ruin my career. It was embarrassing. I was getting pulled into my boss's office because of them, even though I was trying my hardest to act professionally and keep my working life apart from the turmoil they had produced. I was forced to tell him what was going on. He was very understanding to his credit, and even expressed regret for having to bring it up. However, the harm had already been done. He seemed a little cautious, and I couldn't blame him. My employment had recently been threatened by members of my own family. I knew I couldn't allow them to continue getting away with destroying every aspect of my life, so I went back to my lawyer and took the next step: obtaining a restraining order. What else could I do? I never imagined things would go to this point. I couldn't allow them to completely destroy every aspect of my life because they weren't going to stop. The entire procedure was drawn out, disorganized, and stressful. Court dates, additional documentation, and a great deal of explanation on my part were all involved. However, I also felt as though I was at last taking back control. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly defending myself by drawing a line that they couldn't cross. My parents lost it when the restraining order was granted. In a guilt-ridden email, my mother claimed that I was destroying the family and that she couldn't believe her own son would act in such a way, arguing that family is supposed to stick together. For the first time, I was unaffected by the same technique she had previously employed. I knew nothing I said would change anything, so I didn't answer. My car was vandalized when I returned home one evening, just when I thought things could finally calm down. I had set my boundaries, and that was that. The word liar had been keyed into its side by someone. Since my parents were the only ones with a motive, it seemed a bit too convenient, even though I couldn't prove it was them. After parking my automobile at a friend's house, I began to feel as though I was always watching over my shoulder. I took every precaution I could think of, including installing security cameras throughout my flat. However, the paranoia persisted, as if I were constantly anticipating the next assault. Fortunately, things began to calm down when the restraining order went into force. In order to convince friends and family to believe me over my parents' distorted story, I still had to do a lot of damage control. Some of them gave me doubtful looks, as if they couldn't quite believe my parents would go that far, but the majority were sympathetic. Even though it was painful, at least I was no longer subject to the incessant manipulation, criticism, and meddling. I was able to begin concentrating on myself at last. After several months, I began to experience a calmness that I hadn't had in a long time. I had taken the necessary precautions to safeguard myself and start over without my parents' always watchful eyes. I received another letter in the mail from a lawyer just when I thought I was finally out of trouble. Initially, I assumed it was just some last-minute paperwork pertaining to the restraining order, but it was actually something entirely different. I was shocked to learn that I was being sued by my parents for emotional distress. They were attempting to sue me for cutting them off after everything they had done to me, claiming that my actions had caused them great emotional distress and that they should be compensated financially. As if they hadn't been the ones to separate me in the first place, they even said that I had estranged them from the rest of the family. I sat there looking at the letter, wondering how things could have gotten so bad. A part of me was just tired, and another part wanted to chuckle at the ridiculousness. This was going to turn ugly. This was no longer simply family drama, it was a legal struggle. I called my lawyer immediately, and she was just as astonished as I was. She had dealt with a lot of difficult family situations, but a parental lawsuit alleging emotional anguish against their own child? It was the first time. Although I knew it wouldn't be simple, she reassured me that we had a strong case. We collected proof of everything that had occurred over the course of the following few weeks, including the restraining order, the harassment, the vandalism, and the paternity test. At least I knew I was doing everything I could to defend myself, even if it was overwhelming. However, the lawsuit wasn't the worst part of it. In an attempt to turn other family members against me, my parents were also contacting them. Soon after, I began receiving messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, including aunts, uncles, and cousins, telling me that I was being selfish and that I should simply make peace with my parents. They all seemed to have been brainwashed into believing that I was the source of all the problems. It was unbelievable to me. I had to shut off even more people because my own family, the people I had grown up with, somehow believed that I was the bad guy in all of this. I unfriended people on social media, blocked family members, and generally cut off any ties to that aspect of my life. I did care about them. Therefore, it wasn't because I didn't care. However, I couldn't keep defending myself to individuals who were unwilling to see the truth and who had already made up their minds. The court date finally came, and I was tired of defending my choices to people who had only heard my parents' side of the story. I arrived accompanied by my attorney, ready to face whatever absurdity my parents would hurl at me, and believe me, it was like watching a circus come to life. My parents had planned a full sob tale about how I had rudely interrupted them without cause, and how they had always been there for me. They simply omitted all the ways they had harmed and deceived me by portraying themselves as the victims. But my lawyer wouldn't have it that way. She went over each of their accusations individually, outlining the harassment, the restraining order, the paternity test, and everything else. Even the judge appeared tired of their story by the end. My parents were compelled to pay my legal bills when the case was dismissed. Although that was a minor triumph, it didn't feel real. My parents made one final effort to get in touch with me after the case, sending me a lengthy letter full of apologies and pledges to change, even though I had won. It seemed like I had just escaped a nightmare, and there was still a lot of damage to cope with. They said they couldn't bear to lose me, and that all they wanted to do was make things right. However, they continued to utilize the same old guilt-tripping bullshit. But this time, I didn't answer. I had already decided. It pained to be cut off from my family entirely, but I couldn't allow them to keep dragging me back into their toxic loop. There was still a part of me that hoped things would improve, no matter how awful they became. But despite the mayhem they brought into my life, I realized I had to put myself, my future, and my mental health first. I have to stop allowing their interpretation of love to ruin my life. Now I was traveling my own route, and for the first time, I was doing it how I wanted to. It turned out that my parents had one more trick up their sleeves, despite my expectation that the lawsuit and restraining order would finally finish this whole ordeal. In all honesty, I was more shocked by their continued attempts to drag me back than anything else. A few months after the case was dropped, things had finally begun to calm down. I felt like I had some breathing room for the first time in a long time, as if I could begin reconstructing my life without their meddling hovering over me. However, I ran into my cousin Amelia one afternoon while out on errands. Although we were never particularly close, we had always gotten along. Since she had largely avoided the family conflict, I thought it would be safe to say hello and spend some time catching up with her. We began discussing business, life, and other topics. However, she gave me a tense look as I was ready to go and asked, "So, are you coming to the reunion next month?" I froze. "Come together?" I asked, totally unprepared. She nodded, appearing uneasy. "Yes, your parents are planning a large family gathering, and, well, they've been telling everyone that you'll be there and that you all want to make amends." I was shocked to hear this. It wasn't simply a get-together. My parents were organizing some sort of ambush reunion, inviting everyone they could think of in an attempt to guilt-trip me into attending and making peace. It was a prelude. They wanted to put me in front of a group of people, including my family, and force me to act as though nothing was wrong. I thanked Amelia for the heads up and told her straight out that I wasn't coming. But to make matters worse, they were telling everyone that I was in on it and that I wanted to be there. She appeared understanding but a little let off. However, it was evident that even she had fallen for the narrative my parents were propagating, which was that they just want to fix things. A part of me wanted to break down the entire tangled history and explain everything to her, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Nothing I said would make someone change their viewpoint if they hadn't already understood it by now. I gave the matter careful thought when I arrived home. It didn't feel right to disregard the reunion, even though I knew I wouldn't be attending. I had previously attempted to ignore their techniques, but they had just made matters worse. I had to be very clear this time. I sat down the following morning and sent my folks one last email. I informed them that I was aware of the reunion, that I had no plans to go, and that I didn't want to be involved in a coerced reconciliation in front of a large group of people. I made it plain that they needed to respect my boundaries and demonstrate that they were aware of the hurt they had caused if they truly wanted to mend our relationship. Nothing was sugarcoated by me. I didn't expect a response, and to be honest, I didn't need one, so I put everything out to exclude any possibility of misunderstanding. I simply wanted to make my position known for all time. Naturally, they couldn't stop there. My dad called a few days later. Although I didn't answer, he left a lengthy and heartfelt voicemail. I was tearing the family apart, he stated, and this reunion was meant to be a fresh start for everyone. I couldn't believe he was actually bringing my grandparents, who had been nothing but supportive of me, into this. He even attempted to guilt-trip me by stating, "Your grandparents would be so disappointed in how you're handling this." They seemed incapable of embracing the possibility that they might be at fault. To make me feel like I was the issue, they would employ any strategy or card. As I listened to the voicemail, I experienced an odd mixture of melancholy and rage. It brought back memories of my childhood, when they would manipulate me and instill guilt in order to get me to comply. And it worked for years. I had always felt that I was responsible for maintaining harmony and making the necessary corrections. I didn't answer the message, but now, at last, I could see it for what it was. A pattern, a cycle of control masquerading as love. Why would it matter? Everything I needed to say had already been said. However, that didn't mean it didn't affect me. I kept thinking about how the family members there would likely view me as the bad guy, the one who wouldn't make peace. I wondered how many of them were aware of the truth, and how many were simply believing my parents' story that I was somehow to blame. The reunion came and went, and I didn't hear from my parents again. On social media, I came across pictures of happy grins, large family embraces, and everyone acting as though everything was ideal. Seeing them continue acting as though nothing had happened after everything they had done was unreal. They had always been skilled at pretending, though, I suppose. A few weeks later, I saw Amelia again, and she told me that the reunion had been a little awkward. It seems that many people are anticipating my arrival, and when I fail to do so, several awkward exchanges ensue. According to Amelia, my parents' attempts to explain my absence were not well received. Some family members even began to worry whether my parents had not been entirely truthful about the circumstances. It felt like a minor win because it was the first time I had heard the family dispute their version. I've been able to avoid all the controversy ever since, but perhaps not everyone was buying into their narrative after all. I'm aware that it still exists, lingering beneath the surface, and I'm confident my parents will ultimately look for a different way to get back in. But for the time being, I feel liberated. It's not easy, but I've learned to put myself first, create boundaries I never imagined I'd be able to uphold, and leave situations that only cause me grief. One of the most difficult things you can do is to cut off your family, no matter how toxic they are. There are still days when I question whether I made the right decision. However, when I think back on how readily they betrayed me and how fast they bought a lie about their own child, I realize that leaving was the only thing left to do. Perhaps one day, things will change. Perhaps my parents will take stock of their actions, acknowledge the harm they have caused, accept responsibility, and make an effort to start over from a real place. Or perhaps they won't, and I won't ever hear them apologize in my life. In any case, I'm okay with it. I'm finally on my own road, with a future that is entirely mine to mold, and I'm done allowing their decisions to dictate how I live. And I feel like I'm living for me, not for the approval or expectations of others, for the first time in a long time. That's where I am right now. It's a new type of freedom, and although it came with a lot of sorrow, I wouldn't swap it for anything. One step at a time, inward motion. Despite the long and difficult journey, I've become stronger and am confident that I will be all right. Even if life doesn't always go as planned, sometimes the most difficult decisions are the ones that bring you to where you were always supposed to be.